chat for a couple minutes. So we're just going to wait for a couple more people to come in, and then we'll start. But in the interim, Brett, how are you doing?
Good, Elizabeth. Yeah, it's a nice sunny day out. Though I haven't spent too much time outside. But yeah, I'm doing okay. As good as one can be in the circumstance.
Right. Have you taken on any kind of different projects in the last couple months, or caught up on projects?
It's a good question. I think I've taken a pause for one, just to slow down during this period. I had just finished a film called Truckers, which just wrapped up in late January, early February, which was looking at America's truck drivers. And it was filled with interviews and sort of a look at the economic conditions of trucking, which is actually kind of, it's funny, if you go out today, truckers are one of the essential workers that are delivering all the goods that we have. So I just wrapped that up. And yeah, I think I've been doing probably like a lot of people, a lot of reading and writing. I've also gotten pretty good as a dad at now helping my kids with online schooling. So that was a whole thing. I have two young children, one in 3rd grade and one in 6th grade. So for all the parents out there that know what that's like, I'm with you. It's a bit of a challenge. So how about you?
We're all working remotely at BRIC, and we're doing these digital programs and planning for the future. So it's generally been really busy, and I find myself kind of in the same routine as I used to be. Like Monday kind of drags, and Friday is kind of an upbeat day, even though the weekend really isn't that exciting. But I managed to get in a little bit of yard work and more cooking. So I can't complain. It's been pretty good. But yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah, and probably like a lot of people, I've been trying to listen to Zoom presentations, ones that I found interesting. There's been a lot of content online. So at some point during a day, my brain kind of shuts off after too many. But I think there's a lot of interesting content that is in conversations that are being generated during this time by artists and all types of folks in the cultural industry. So I've been doing a fair share of that too.
Yeah, I really hope that continues. It almost seems like it's too much. It's too much to keep up with, but there's a lot of valuable ideas out there, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. So So go ahead. Okay, so I think actually we will begin. So let me greet everybody again. Hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Ferrer. I'm Chief Curator at BRIC, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to BRIC's digital space, BRICxHome, and to this program with artist Brett Wallace, Artistic Response to Crisis. I'm really, really pleased that Brett agreed to join us today, because he's not only a really gifted and interesting artist, and I hope he has a chance to talk a little bit about that, but he's also a theorist and researcher who thinks really expansively about topics around work and labor. Today, he's going to be focusing on artist work and its value in the present moment, as well as the kind of thinking that artists can apply as we think about the future. And I think these are all really salient topics as we grapple with this social and economic crisis. As I mentioned, this program is part of BRICxHome, our virtual programming series that includes conversations as well as poetry, art, music, programs for children, and a lot more. You can support BRIC's mission by donating to our Creative Future Relief Fund. You'll find the address on our website. You'll find our website address in the chat, and you'll also find more information about programs that are upcoming in the next few weeks. So that the program runs smoothly, we've muted everybody, but I invite you anytime to add your questions to the Q&A. If you're joining us today by Facebook, you can also add your comments at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the second half of the hour. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Brett Wallace, a New York-based multimedia artist and filmmaker, as well as founder of Amazing Industries, a research engine that fosters discussions about work among artists, citizens, and workers. His work has been reviewed in ArtNet, the New York Times, Art News, the Brooklyn Rail, Hyperallergic, and many more publications. And he's also exhibited at the New School, Nurture Art, Silas von Morisset Gallery, and the Spring Break Art Show, which is always one of my favorites each year. Brett himself has worked in technology, he has researched technology, and he continues through his art to advocate how technology impacts workers, and societies. He is an alumnus of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, also of the Harvard Business School, and he holds an MFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art. So with that, I think I'm going to turn things over to Brett, and we'll begin the program. Thank you all again.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the team at BRIC for hosting this conversation. Also, thank you for all of us, or thank you for joining us here on Zoom or on Facebook Live for the conversation, and looking forward to hearing from many of you through the chat or the Q&A as we enter this space. So for today, what I'm going to share with you is sort of a framework and a mapping. There's not solutions or answers here, but really sort of my ongoing reflection and some of the questions and meditations and thoughts that I've been thinking about as it relates to what's going on in the world, how I've been personally trying to cope with it. Obviously we're all coping in different ways, and this sort of conversation, which is related to my work about art and the economy, has been one way for me to sort of reflect back. This project, in my thinking, is really based on values of collectivity and care. And, I think, and I hope I'm speaking today in solidarity with not only artists, but arts workers and really all workers who are sort of facing struggles as we go through this crisis. So over the next 20, 25 minutes, what I'm going to do is share some remarks based on sort of a web page that I've been working on for the last couple of weeks. And I'm going to talk about 3 levels, spending about 5 minutes each to 7 minutes on these levels. The first is the landscape. So just trying to get my head around and share what I think is happening with the overall landscape of work. The second piece is trying to make sense of the art worlds and how they may be reshaped. And the third piece is potential responses. These are the 3 sort of levels that I've been trying to sort of segment out or categorize just to make sense of everything that's going on right now in the world in the public health crisis. So I'll try to keep this to about 25 minutes or so we end right about the halfway point at 5:30, and we can open it up for Q&A. Jumping into the landscape, and I should say too, this is a website that is an ongoing project. It is full of information, and I will keep adding to it. There's a lot of links, so something that you can refer back to overall. To start with the landscape, I would break down the landscape, at least from an economic standpoint, and what's happening with the recent public health crisis into 3 different categories. The first is wealth. The second is systematic inequality, and the third is health and well-being. And I think if you look at the first graphic, one of the things it shows is, what is the share of U.S. income, not only in this crisis, but prior to it, leading up to it. Over the last 4 decades, what we've seen is essentially wages have been flat for working families. And despite that, people have had to contend with increases in housing costs, transportation, fuel, food, education, et cetera. So we often hear these stories that 50% of Americans or so are living paycheck to paycheck, and small businesses have an incredibly tight payroll, often with only 1 or 2 months in hand. And a lot of this is the result of the fact that the upper class, the 1%, has been gaining wealth over the last 40 to 50 years, while wealth for other categories have either stayed flat or has been eroded. And that is an incredible challenge, and something that has been in place prior to this crisis that is only being further exacerbated by it. I think another point that I would bring up around this is, as we've seen, the jobs impact that this will have on this existing sort of wealth inequality. So right now, if we look at the labor force, at least in the US, it's about 165 million people. The last time I checked, the claims in unemployment were about 33 million jobs claiming unemployment. And that's only folks that may be reporting it. It could actually be underreported. If we look at that 33 million, there was just a new study that came out by the Chicago Becker-Friedman Institute that says 42% of those 33 million jobs may not be coming back. So that goes against the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration, which is banking on those jobs coming back, but they may not be coming back. And if they do come back, they may be in increasingly automated factories. So not only is the wealth and wages an ongoing issue, now we're in this economic depression of jobs. The second major factor I would talk about is the systematic inequality that we have to contend with. So one of the things I think that really came out of the 2008-2009 crisis and drove a lot of global awareness, despite lots of publication prior to that, is basically how global capitalism is a system of predatory lending through subprime mortgages, through student loans, and it really tries to rescue itself through the expansion of credit. So it basically lures working class and precarious communities further into debt to save itself. And then when the bubble crashes, as it did in 2008, 2009, the house bails out banks. And instead of helping homeowners, it forecloses on homes, therefore creating even more of that wealth inequality, and then forcing people in the public to endure, years of austerity. We won't get into too much of the austerity issue right now, but it's not only a US crisis, that's a global crisis. There's been rebellions happening in many, many other places in the world as a result of this inequality. So not just a US specific issue. The third piece I would talk about is the health and well-being. So because of those trends, capitalism itself is a patient in shock, but it is basically preying off of the health and well-being of citizens. So in a way, what we've seen in this crisis is not only has neoliberalism privatized the healthcare system, but it's also put workers, including medical workers and other frontline workers, on the front lines without the proper medical equipment, which is a major issue. The challenge with that I've seen really in the last week or so, which many of you probably have saw, and it sort of is really shocking. Dan Patrick, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, recently came out and said, opening the economy is more important than saving a few people. And that is a sort of frame that just really shocked me. The fact that we would consider the profits of an American business economy more over the grandparents of people, or those in elderly nursing homes who can't isolate, or those folks from working class communities, increasingly Black and people of color who are on the front lines. So it's not the Dan Patricks of the world that are taking on that risk of the reopening of the economy, it's more vulnerable populations. So I think based on those trends, we are clearly in a sort of disaster area where capitalism is preying on our communities. And yet, as Frederick Jameson says, it's easier to see the end of the world before the end of capitalism. It is just a system that keeps reinforcing and reinventing itself. So I'm going to pause there on this section and move to the next section, but I did outline in this section some areas and questions that I have, such as, can we ever get rid of a system like this? And some areas that I actually am hopeful for, because in trauma like this, it does open an opportunity for change. I'll now jump, just with the time, and keep an eye on the time, to the second section that I've started to think about, which is what does all of this kind of mean for the art worlds that we live in? For me, it's really hard to separate the art world from this broader political economy we live in, as it is for many of us on the call. It's just a part of our everyday lives. But I do want to say up front that it's very hard to look at the art world as a single monolithic sort of entity. If I was describing it to my son in the 3rd grade, and I know this is probably preaching to the choir for everyone on this call, I would describe it by this like little graphic with the earth, looking at the multiple layers, right? So the art world is not one monolithic thing. It's actually built up of many, many layers in many different worlds. It's built on different values and political ideologies. It's built on different forms of labor. There's many different jobs in the art world, and there's also many different worlds within this. So I've tried to at least list out 3 categorical worlds. One would be the experimental artist-run practices and projects that are scattered all across the country and world. There's a real energy to these and a real transformative nature to them. There's another layer of nonprofit spaces and independent publishers, residencies. And of course, there is a larger world in terms of its profit making, not necessarily in terms of its eyeballs or the amount of people in it, but its relationship to capital, of large museums, institutions, commercial galleries, etc. One way I've sort of thought to even further break it down is inside of each of those worlds, there's various types of labor. So there's all types of jobs, right? And the jobs take different categories. You can be fully employed, part-time, unionized or not, subcontracted. So these types of jobs follow the typical trends in any part of the economy. If you look at a big tech company, they would have, like a Google, they would have a similar structure of subcontracted workers and full-time workers, et cetera. And inside of that, one of the things I've tried to sort of pull out is, from my perspective, what are some of the core issues that have been sort of rising up, at least over the last 2 or 3 years? Some of these issues have a huge historical arc to them, but there have been spikes that we've seen in the last number of years that I think have influence now, not only in the reshaping of things, but they'll continue to have influence as some of the things and demands that people in the art world, including workers and artists and cultural workers, are demanding of the institutions they work within or work for or work with. Those issues I would categorize as 3 of them that seemed to sort of rise to the top. There's many more, but the top 3, at least from what I've seen, would be 1, the demands of workers for fair wages and conditions of employment. And we've seen this in the wave of unionization that has taken place in the museum sector. I included a lot of details around that in the document that I won't get into now, but there's actually been a lot of exciting things happening here in New York with the New Museum, in the Tenement Museum, in the Guggenheim, all building activities, and even outside of New York with the Fry Art Museum, et cetera. I know LA MoCA has had a bunch of things going on, and of course the Marciano Art Foundation. There's been this like wave of activity, and I don't think that's limited to the art world around the demands that workers are making. If you look at, for example, in November of 2018, Google had the biggest walkout in tech's history. 20,000 workers, which was about 10% of Google's staff, had a walkout, and it was around the sexual allegations that were brought to an executive who had a $90 million payout, leaving the company as a result. So actions are taking place not only in the art world, but broader. And I also think that there's been some really interesting horizontal things as well. So the art handlers, and I included a quote further down in this document, the art handlers Alliance has done some really interesting things by creating a Bill of Rights for art handlers sort of horizontally across industries. A Bill of Rights that would hold higher labor standards for employers who are hiring art handlers. They've also put out a recent survey looking at the impact that cultural workers and art handlers are going through. So in a way, they're advocating for higher standards and labor rights, which I think is just a really exciting thing. And yeah, so right there's a link to the Bill of Rights, a link to the survey, et cetera. And I pulled a quote from their sort of Bill of Rights, which is saying, art handlers are the backbone of a growing and profitable industry. In a way that reminded me back to what we were just talking about, which was in a way, truck drivers. Truck drivers are the backbone of the American economy. We don't get the goods that we have, whether that's food or water or clothing, without truck drivers bringing them to distribution centers. So this idea of art wages is in conditions of employment is one major issue. I think a second one is art's relationship to debt. And this could be in the form of student debt. And further down, I included a graphic. Many of you probably have seen Occupy Museums and the work that they've done around debt fair, which is, I think, a very important issue that's rising, because I think in their manifesto, it states basically that debt is the key to sort of experiencing art. If we look at, I remember about a year ago, I sat down with a graduate student for a studio visit. And right at the start of the visit, the person had wrote down their debt that they were graduating with. And it was over $100,000. And we spent the rest of the time talking about work, not artwork, but work, how that could possibly be repaid. And in an art world where artists may not necessarily be selling work, or may not have an interest in selling work in that regard, paying off such debt is a huge challenge. Or if a person were to work in a cultural institution, they might be making an economic sacrifice to work there. So recouping that debt is just a massive thing. And I think this will play into the debt cancellations and the rent strikes that are happening, because it's a major issue. The third piece that I'll mention as a core issue is, I think, art's entanglement with money. And we've seen this over the last year or so really rise up in a couple of occasions. But again, it's been one of these ongoing issues that's been happening for decades. The two issues that seemed to gain the most attention, of course, was the Warren Kander's resignation from the Whitney. And this is, I won't go into all the details because it's a very well publicized and well documented story, but the idea that the board of trustees for major museums are run in a plutocratic way, meaning it's sort of a pay to play to be in those positions, creates a sort of large gap, not only a gap in the wealth inequality between the workers in a museum or the artist showing there, but also at times a gap in the political ideology. So if you have a board member who is selling weapons of tear gas on the one hand, and then governing over a space of dissent and a democratic space of exhibition, there's obviously a huge gap. And it's become increasingly hard for museum boards to square those up, and thus leading to many of the strikes held by Decolonize This Place and Kander's resigning. Nan Golden and Payne is another clear example of trying to, and successfully launching a campaign to encourage museums to disavow the name of the Sacklers and not work with that family based on their role in marketing the opioid OxyContin. And I think what's interesting about Nan's effort in the work with Payne is it goes beyond the art world. The vision there is to really, as she said, to really eradicate the stigma of the actual epidemic. So it goes far beyond the art world. And I think that's an interesting example of where some degree of agitation can have a win. And so I think small wins are important. Andrea Fraser has written beautifully, I think, about some of the changes that museum boards need to make. I've included some material about that. But I do just want to spend maybe another 2 minutes on this section, just talking about and reflecting on maybe some of the changes that will happen going forward. I do think it's really hard to say, and I don't want to speculate too much, but if we look at those three worlds, I do think there's a couple things that are going to play out. One, I think museums are going to have to contend with this increasing sort of divide between ethics and aesthetics. And they're going to have to find alternative governance models, or they're going to have to keep facing this kind of onward pressure from people in their staff and people in the community. And I think it's important for them to really consider these governance models, because it's an urgent and vital topic for the reasons we sort of briefly discussed. I think another part of the art world is going to try to open as quickly as possible, because there are a lot of profits at stake at the higher end. And that has a whole sort of waterfall of issues with it. We're already seeing things like new online sites that are really about frictionless commerce, about selling works quicker. But I do think that part of that world, and this is part of the challenge, is its goal is to reinforce itself. Its goal is to not change the status quo. And that's a problem because that sort of upper part of the art world is only serving a small degree of art stars. And it's not the most democratic way, as we've sort of all have experienced, I'm sure, in some degree or another, to sustain a career. So I think that's going to be kind of a continued issue. I think in the middle market, the middle layers where there's a lot of spaces that may have under $1 million in operating budget, it's very hard to see how many of those spaces are going to be able to make payroll if they're reliant on grants or state funding or private foundations. Based on what we talked about earlier, the economy is just in a really fragile place. And I think that goes for a lot of us as individuals who are working in this art world. Because of the economic depression and the structuring of art world employment, we're sort of tied into the broader world of employment. I was looking the other day at just who are the actual companies or places that are hiring. And it won't surprise many of you on the call. The only real places I could find that are large scale hiring are Dollar General, Walmart, Amazon, places that are like large retail, low wage, highly surveilled jobs. And that's a problem. Again, we talked about capitalism's inability to sort of be a job creation engine anymore. So it's a problem that's going to impact many people and has already. I think there will be a lot of energy with artist-run projects. And I think that's maybe a good transition to the last section of this, which starts to look at artistic responses. And I will say this is a sort of mapping in progress. It is not, and it's more based on my own personal reflection and questions. It is not a exhaustive list of all of the responses. That there's far too many, and but it is at least a way for me to try to get my head around how can artists respond and how are they responding, especially around positions of self-care and sustainability and activism and solidarity. So I think about 3 different levels of potential response. And as many of you know, my work has had a deep investigation, exploration of Amazon, for those who know my work. In scrolling down, you can see sort of the first image is this Amazon commercial. We've all seen these commercials where it's a brand going out of their way to do something public to generate compassion, usually around their workforce. Some of these have struck me as very sort of off-putting in a way, mainly because there's many employees at Amazon who don't feel thanked, that are on the front line without proper equipment. So I think when we start to talk about what is artistic response, thinking about the wider frame of cultural production, we have a situation where brands are using a crisis to sell us things. And last I checked, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, made $24 billion during this pandemic, and is thanking his workers without supplying them with the right equipment on the job. And people are getting fired for speaking out about that, like Chris Smalls in the JFK 8 warehouse in Staten Island. So there's a huge asymmetry here. And I use this as an example that I've been thinking about because we are a part of this cultural production world. And it has me thinking about what is the impact of this on the responses. So I think there's a couple levels that I was thinking about that I've kind of listed out here. One, I come back to the quote by John Berger that all art is political, and whether one is politically active in their practice or not, the ways that artists can respond are literally limitless. I don't believe that one has to be politically active to actually make art in a time like this. Of course, there's just an absolute myriad of responses in ways that people are reflecting on this time. And in fact, I have a lot of friends, one of which I was messaging last night, who is on hiatus, just not making work and using this as a time to do other things, whether that's staying healthy, taking care of family, etc. For folks that do have more activist practices, the thing that I've always reminded myself of, it's not to try to put art into that space, especially during a crisis time, but it's a time to reflect on the sites of political activity. Because sometimes, and Ben Davis has talked more eloquently about this than I could, at times, if you get involved, especially in some of the Amazon labor work, one thing I've learned is sometimes it's not your work that's needed, it's your body on the front line, or your design skills as an artist to maybe work on a poster. There's other ways to get involved. And sometimes that's a higher priority than actually making any work. There are a ton of responses that I've been seeing from friends about how they're reacting to this crisis. I'll maybe just touch on a couple of examples, and then we can kind of pause, and I'll put it back to Elizabeth to open it up for Q&A. So as we scroll down, there's probably 3 or 4 examples I would just point out. By the way, there's lots of questions here, questions that I have for myself as an artist, and I'd love if you would read them at some point and let me know what you think. There's meditations that I've been thinking about, like this one, it's enough to stay healthy. One work, as we scroll down, is Sarah Santos Negron, who is a colleague of mine from Puerto Rico, who started this project basically on the first day of isolation and lockdown in Puerto Rico as a way of gathering in her neighborhood on the island. And she's been gathering sort of a plant species every day and sort of archiving them. And I thought it was just an incredibly beautiful gesture, not only visually, but symbolically, about how we're each dealing with our own isolation, especially in the age of climate change. As we scroll down, another piece that sort of struck me was this piece here, which I just found out about from a friend of mine, by John Schipper. It was basically a drawing, I think a 3D rhino sketch of a mobile testing unit that could be deployed in New York. And I thought it was really interesting. I actually included a screenshot from Instagram because some of the comments were talking about ideas of social productivity. Someone said that, sent this to a friend, and it's kind of circulating around different offices, both in government. So this idea that art as a form of social production or social good also has a long history. And I, without getting too much into it, I think that's an interesting, potent space right now. The last thing I'll say is if you scroll up a tiny bit, you'll see this quote. And I won't read the quote, but I do want to just draw your attention to one project I thought was interesting. It's actually an anonymous project by a colleague who put out a call to complaint. And it was within the context of working at an academic institution. This is a faculty member, adjunct faculty member. And it was about basically drawing support within the academic institution around having to contend with sort of a top-down power situation and being put in this space where you're not really able to speak out. So it was a way to like collectively gather a lot of forms of resistance in the form of sick speech. And it was kind of a webpage on Rise Up that you could, other members of the community could kind of write in. And it sort of exists as a document, a manifesto, a form of radical self-publishing and collective publishing. And I think some of the projects I've listed below sort of talk to that or talk to other themes here. But I guess in conclusion, what I would say is we're clearly in a public health crisis and one of increasing economic depression. This is having massive impact on the art world. And I think that as artists, one of the things that is important to, and I want to put this into this space, is that standing in international solidarity with other artists and arts workers and international workers to demand the things that will help us all is really critical at this time. And whether that's through work or not through artwork or through other means or else, it's a real, I think, time that we think of artists as what benefits us benefits the broader array of cultural workers, arts workers, and workers all throughout the world, whether that's universal healthcare or rent abolition or internet for all, so on and so forth. So I'll pause there, and Elizabeth, I'll pass it back to you so we can open it up. And thank you for letting me take the space and walk you through those thoughts. And by the way, Elizabeth, you might be on mute, just as a heads up.
Okay, how about this?
You're back.
I'm back. Sorry about that. So I'll just start again. So what I was saying is that there is just so much to unpack in what you said, going, from the individual artist and their own issues and problems and economic situation to your community, your city, and then these many art worlds that are intersecting and challenging each other with different sense of ethos. I think the first thing that I want to ask you is, we're talking about a crisis. We're talking about a health crisis, an economic crisis, a lot of individuals in crisis, public health crisis. What do you think is the future for artists? I mean, I guess one thing that I've heard that sounds a little bit like a fairy tale, but I'm wondering if you think there's any possibility here is sort of a WPA program for artists. Because I mean, what artists are going to need is money.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of good ideas, but how will that be enacted? How will artists pay their rent, once health crisis ends?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have all the answers to that, and I think there's people that are financial experts and people that have studied the WPA, even in the art world, that probably have a better grasp. But I think the way that I think about that is, yes, there needs to be more relief. Clearly, I think the U.S. amount right now is $6 trillion in relief, and could be up to 10 million as more waves of relief get announced. I think the challenge with that is, how does that relief actually come down to the art world? I think I was looking at the U.S. Alliance of Museums had made an ask of X amount of money that they needed for payroll, and they got Y amount of money, a slice. So there's a reckoning that it seems like with the state intervention that there's only so much. Particularly that's heightened because back in the 2008-2009 crisis, China was able to take on a large part of our debt. The problem is in this crisis, China's economic growth has slowed, and we have this huge amount of debt now. And I think there's going to be a fight, just like there's been a fight over protective equipment between states. Who gets who's politically aligned to who, as this aid trickles down. So as we get into places of the art world, we're sort of dealing with, if you're a small business, you're sort of contending with this Byzantine small business administration process of getting aid. And as we saw, even that was a disaster with, I think it was like some of the bigger restaurants like Ruth Chris Steakhouse getting aid, and not, the small restaurant on the corner that we love. So there's this contention that that is happening in the system as it shots itself. So I think it's incredibly challenging as aid comes down. In particular, with artist relief funds, there's been some exciting things happening to build a bridge, as organizations have been like trying to collaborate and push relief to artists. The problem is that there's just not enough, it seems, to go around. And there's another issue, I think, with that is it still follows that individual artist route. You know, it comes down to an individual. It doesn't speak about the recovery of social organizations that artists rely upon for other things. So I don't know what that means, Elizabeth. I don't know if it, means people are taking on second and third jobs at various places, like getting any job, reducing the stigma from lower wage work, like I mentioned, like Amazon or Dollar General, or places that are hiring, because if employment's down across the board and relief funds have dried up, what do you do? And I don't have the foresight to understand yet what does reskilling mean. Mike Davis, I guess I'll end with this one last point. Mike Davis said something the other day that was really interesting. If we could only redeploy the talent that we have in certain industries to other industries, like, could you imagine so many museum educators have been cut. I was looking at the spreadsheet the other day from Museum and Transparency that's tracking the layoffs. So many folks have been cut in that department, in visitor services. How could we redeploy people to like healthcare or other areas of social reproduction that are needed right now? That's really hard in our existing system, but that would be an amazing concept right now if we could pull that off, so that people could stay employed. I think you're bringing up another question of full employment. Does the government need just to fully employ everyone right now in some way, no matter what the debt? And that is something a lot of folks are fighting for.
Well, I think this whole conversation has so much importance to New Yorkers, because we love New York and we make a lot of sacrifice to live in New York, and we all spend too much for our apartments. But I wonder if people are going to have to leave. I mean, there's already been a lot of artists moving, upstate and to Philadelphia and other cities. But I just wonder if, you've lost that educator job at MoMA. Can you hang on, or do you look for a little more comfortable situation in a smaller city?
Yeah, and this is where I think that the issues of rent cancellation, debt abolishment have got to come in, because you can't pay rent with something you don't have. It just doesn't equate. And I also think about that concept from students that are graduating right now. They're graduating into chaos, let alone the debt that they may have taken on to go through that educational process that perhaps promised them like XYZ, or painted a vision for them in the future of XYZ that just doesn't equate.
You talked just a little bit about galleries, and I think you were really referring to the Paces and the Larry Gagosians of the world. But what about smaller Lower East Side galleries, artist-run spaces? What do you see as the future for say the Lower East Side art community gallery district?
Oh, I don't know. There's Leslie Heller closed. I saw that after a long run. I wouldn't be surprised, just given what we're talking about, the cost of space, a contraction in that world. And it's sad, because a lot of those spaces gave artists their first shows. They're incredibly experimental. They are sort of a lifeblood of the art world in that way. But again, unless there's a sort of a rebalancing of the inequality across the financial sector, I just don't see, again, coming back to the place of rent. I do think, though, that overall space is made up of many different, also exciting possibilities. So there's artist-run projects that may exist online. There's different types of frameworks, and this is not speaking to Lower East Side, but just broadening out that conversation. There's exciting things that could happen with different co-ops and different new forms of working relationships. Co-ops can actually be, fairly resilient in times like this, cooperative type structures. But to your point, renting space right now in an area of the Lower East Side is just absolutely a massive challenge, especially when you look at what's happening, not only, and I don't know if the stats in front of me, but just Lower Manhattan in general is just being sort of eviscerated because people are just not only are people not making products, but people aren't buying products. So this is not just like a demand problem, it's a supply problem too. So the economy is being hit on both sides. So I don't know what happens to those spaces, especially if those spaces, and many of them are largely experimental, and they're not interested in perhaps selling works, nor should they be, just hanging on. So I think that's where we need to get into sort of this conversation about relief for spaces like that.
Yeah, we'll see in the next few months, I think. So we have a question from Tal Beery. In your research, have you come across any interesting and successful worker-owned models for arts institutions in the US? I wonder whether more established arts institutions would move in this direction if there were highly visible models that worked at the scale.
That's a great question from Tal, and he's brilliant. He may know more about it than I, but I think there's about 7,000 worker-owned enterprises in the country right now. And just looking at it from that level, and it's across a huge gamut of industries. The last I looked at it, a lot of them are in retail spaces. My favorite one is a Baltimore bike shop, where I used to get my bike fixed in graduate school. It's a worker-owned business, 7 people, a co-op that's been existing for, I think, 10 years. So a resiliency model. And clearly there's a wonderful sort of like Bill of Rights about how they run their business and their mission and values. It's a wonderful space. And there's many other of these types of businesses, both physical space and there's an entire movement of platform co-ops. Trevor Schultz and there's folks under the Platform Co-op Consortium, which is run out of the New School, have been on this for a while. There's all types of, I would call arts and cultural startups, music platforms that are worker run, all various types of things that I think are interesting models. I think to Tal's question is about what are cultural institutions that are worker owned that are at scale. New Day Films has been around a long time, I think 30 years, 30, 40 years. And I believe they started, it's a group of filmmakers, I think it's about 30 people or so. I think they started because they were making feminist films that at the time weren't being received in the market of the film industry back in the 70s and 80s. And they created their own sort of structure in their own way to kind of band together as independent filmmakers to create a sort of collective, cooperative platform to then move forward. Is 30 people the type of scale? It's more than 10, but it's not 300. There's, what's the place in Spain? Mondragon, I think, is the largest worker-owned co-op in the world. And I think that's in the thousands of people, if I recall, and it's across diversified industries. So I'll have to like fact check myself on that and go back and look. It's been a little while since I looked at them. But what's interesting is at some degree of scale, they run into the same issues. Their organization has become less democratic and more like a traditional business structure. So they've run into governance issues, trying to maintain a certain scale. So I think Tal's asking a good question. In the art world, how could a worker co-op form for resiliency, and how big could it get to retain the most democratically run structure as absolutely possible? And if there's an example of that, I would love to see that. I'll make a note, Tal, to do some more research and see if anyone else in our community can drum something up.
Hey, we'd love some more questions, but I think there's one that I've really been wanting to ask is about, your work on labor is really fascinating and it's in depth and it's very layered. But how do you come upon this as a visual artist who also does, not really traditional artistic projects, but who comes from very much from a contemporary art background? And maybe you want to touch a little on amazing industries.
Yeah, it's a great question. So for me, it it started when I really sat down to ask myself the question in making art: what do I care about most? What is the thing I care about? And for me, that has been workers' rights and collective rights and equality and care, and these sort of issues that we've been sort of talking about. Um, Going back to part one of that presentation, you can see workers' rights have been eroding for 40 years. And for someone who studied technology, I originally started this question looking at Amazon. Back in 2014, 2015, Amazon was still on its growth track, but its labor record was not nearly as exposed as it is now. So I started to unpack Amazon as a potential site of not only labor, both physical and in a warehouse and software, but also from the standpoint of it's a business going across multiple industries. So Amazing Industries was actually a reaction to Amazon. The name was amazing, and it was meant to be like a mirror of Amazon's labor record reflecting back on itself. So a lot of the early projects I was doing were like interventions into the Amazon ecosystem in solidarity with workers. What shifted in the practice is actually going to Amazon sites of where strikes in solidarity with workers, organizing rallies in connection with other organizing groups on the ground, and being a participant in those, both sometimes my physical body or like my art skills as a way to like design posters or be on the ground for documentation. But that site has been a really rich experience for me, and the ideas within my work have come out of that experience. So the ideas of making a film about truckers, who are some unionized, some not, basically also a part of that Amazon ecosystem. And that was the last film I worked on. So that's a real potent space for me. In terms of amazing industries going forward, it's interesting. One of the things I'm thinking about is, in terms of employment, is how could artists work inside of a broader economy, building off programs like the Artist Placement Group from the 1960s, which was a group that placed artists inside companies, not to necessarily create work, but to help those companies rethink their relationship to either labor or political issues, et cetera. This was founded by John Latham, Barbara Stavini out of London. So that's like kind of this really interesting space. Could Amazing Industries be like a left wing, like a left consulting type of think tank, very similar to how on the more conservative side you have like a McKinsey who is helping those companies with strategy? Could we use a left leaning one?
I want to open it up to more questions. Let's just give it a moment and see if anybody wants to ask one more question before we wrap things up. Okay, well, Brett, I think you've been so succinct and complete that you've really taken care of things for us today.
Okay.
And I think said a lot, but also asked a lot of questions for us to think about. So I think this is really such a potent material for us to think about and chew on, and I think come up with our own solutions, because I think ultimately artists are most effective when they kind of have the means of communication and the agency to create without the pressure of the galleries and the art fairs and such. So I think that I hope that this is the beginning of future discussions, and we will, time will tell how artists will continue to respond and what kind of support is out there for artists. So for all the artists out there, I wish you all really, really well. BRIC is always here to support you. And so we're going to continue with these kinds of programs, and programs in our other disciplines in television and music, and programs for children. So please tune in again. Find us on social media and on our website. And with that, Brett, I want to thank you very, very much. This has really been incredibly useful, and look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, and thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, folks, for joining. I look at this as just one of the conversations across many in our community towards collectivity and new ways of sort of thinking about whatever normal is, because we're not going back to the normal we once had. So whatever that new environment is, I think we have an opportunity to reshape it and reimagine it. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to chat with you today about what some of that could look like in solidarity with arts workers and other workers. So thank you.
Thanks, Brett. And thanks to everybody. Thank you again. Bye-bye.